Okay, I think this is going to be our last episode on the Republic. We're going to try to hammer through book 9 and 10, but only in the interpretive essay, just because it's getting a little bit dry in the actual text itself. Book 9 is mostly seems to be focusing on the description of the tyrannical man himself, and then I think book 10 goes into the more into the forms. And so, anyways, the interpretive essay is just going to be much shorter and a bit more compact and actually more to the point as well. Uh, Interesting points in Canadian politics is that Mark Carney, congratulations, did take on the leadership of the Liberal Party. I've been trying to like assess him for kind of his policies, and I heard one description of him as or as the Liberal Party in general was that they are shock absorbers to corporate policies. Um, and so, like, the only time liberal policies actually seem to make an impact from the social perspective is when they're actually mathed out properly and actually contributing towards the bigger system. So, like, really, the only major milestones that Trudeau was able to accomplish on the left that has any economic impact was like the $10 day daycare, which is huge. Having the framework started for pharmacare and dental care is also important, but they're not really that big of economic drivers. It seems like the $10 day daycare is certainly going to be profound, and it's going to be very hard to take that away from in the future, or even to dismantle it all if conservatives get into power and want to, just because of like how heavily we rely on that. We're going to be relying on that system, and we do already. BC, it's a fantastic program, um, but I think that'll be one of his legacy projects that'll actually be carried forward. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff he did was performative on the left, taking a knee for Black Lives Matter. Um, I guess like there, these substantial amount of um, reconciliation efforts made and payouts made to First Nation communities have undeniably had an impact, and the number of boil water advisories have gone down substantially on reserves. Interestingly, I'm pretty sure there when I first started university in 2015, which was the same year Trudeau took over, I would have just started university a few months before he became prime minister. Um, he it was noted in the campaign that there was still like 150 reserves in Canada who are still on boil water advisories. That number is very difficult to get down because of the heavy infrastructure costs in Canada in general. But also, like, these communities are just so far remote, you have to build water treatment plants or uh, figure out some way to filter it or get access to clean water. Canada in general, even though we are a fairly rich country, our public infrastructure deficit is massive just because we don't have a lot of people. The rural, remote northern communities are very spread out. And I mean, our houses just like even in mid-sized to even larger cities, like our houses are just, we just have excessive amounts of sprawl, which means like there's more pipe in between houses, and there's more sewer line, there's more hydro line, there's more water line, and that adds up on a national scale. So to run Canada effectively, our public, and oh man, even cell towers, that's even a problem out here. Like the drive from Gold River to Campbell River, because people kind of see Gold River as a more distant suburb or a suburb of Campbell River, and which is true because we go there for everything. But we don't even have consistent cell coverage all the way from Gold River to Campbell River, just because it's not really economical to put another cell tower in. And you can imagine if you put one in, it's like okay, you put it in, but now you have to maintain it, and the economics just aren't there really. Um, so it'd be interesting in order to reduce that public infrastructure deficit. There's things you could do like a Starlink system where people can make phone calls over the internet, like they do with what's that? What do they use in Brazil? Oh, the green phone, WeChat? No, that's China. WhatsApp. Yeah, that's it. WhatsApp. They use that in Brazil, and they just go over the internet and call each other. We could be doing similar type things in Canada, where you just use a VoIP ID or whatever and go over the internet. I mean, we could do it with Messenger, but as long as you're connected to the internet, be fine. And so like if you could have direct cell communications with a satellite over the internet, there's potentially a lot of rural, remote northern communities who could save a lot on that public infrastructure debt, just by not having to have so many cell towers, which is a perfect example of how to implement that here in Canada. We just finished wrapping Vancouver Island with BC's been in this long decade and a half long fight to get fast, reliable internet to the rural, remote northern communities of BC. UBCM, the Union of BC Municipalities, has been working on that. I think their first resolution was passed in like 2013. So it's been an ongoing issue for a very long time. But anyways, going back to Mark Carney, the if you see him as like a shock absorber for a lot of corporate policies and while still trying to accomplish socialist-esque ideas through a business savvy perspective, I think number one, he could be the person to implement UBI, which could be very interesting, but also he's going to be making, I mean, this is exactly what we can expect from him. He's going to be making some shrewd financial decisions to very much benefit businesses. And that side of things has always made a lot of liberals and leftists sort of uncomfortable, but it's very clear, like, you could see what the work Doge is doing, the craziest idea for a government agency head up by just some billionaire, but public service in general has become so massively inefficient that it's ripe and needs to be ripped up and changed. Here in the Canada and the States, it's interesting because the core values of Canada is that where you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the United States, Canada's motto is peace, order, and good government. And where your values are as a country is often where you'll see a high percentage of your young, smart people head in that direction. So in the United States, I think a large percentage of your ambitious young people want to get into Wall Street for very obvious reasons. Like, that's where all the money is, that's where all the power is. And like, I think like there's another subsect of like, of course, there's like the federal government is a very enticing gig as well. But in Canada, I think a large percentage of your young people, because there isn't very many inroads into Bay Street, the Canadian equivalent in Toronto, and we have such a diffuse power model and such a huge country, the only place there is really for a lot of the young ambitious people to go is into government, because there isn't very many on-roads into oil and gas or lumber or into really any other industry. Like, we don't have any very many industries that would be able to take in a lot of competent young people. And so you kind of have like military leadership, which hasn't always been enticing over the past 10 years. And then you also have the government. And so government's at 3 different levels. And yeah, I think that's been easily one of the number one places that young ambitious people go is into government or into government agencies and the like. And so it's not only been hyper competitive here in Canada, but it also means we have every time you think that that politician is doing something weird, especially at the national level, it's because like our bureaucrats are ridiculously intelligent. And like, especially when you're talking about like our federal government responding, it's always done hyper. They're playing chess, not checkers. When you see Trudeau responding to Trump, they're playing chess. They're not playing this checkerboard game that you could see going back and forth in the media. They are hyper intelligent. They provide in-depth reports, and it doesn't matter who's prime minister. They get access to all this like hyper intelligent thinking. So like how it normally works is like you have like your prime minister, your ministers, like premier. Like you can kind of do this at the provincial and federal level. Your premier, your ministers, your under your parliamentary secretaries, which is like the assistants helping the minister, who are also from the political class. Like, so more people in within the majority party have roles within the actual government. And then you have like your opposition party with the same kind of structure, but the governing party then gets access, has a deputy minister for each ministry. So the prime minister has a deputy minister, which is the top deputy minister for all the deputy ministers. They're in charge of those deputy ministers. And then they have assistant deputy ministers, and that's when you're starting to get into the bureaucracy. So the deputy ministers will meet with the ministers, and it's a formal meeting, and they can have very direct conversations. That's the meeting between the bureaucracy and the political. And then from there, it then works out from the assistant deputy ministers and down. But like sometimes, like so in BC, for instance, there is our deputy minister for John Horgan. I don't know if he's still there or not. I haven't looked at it in a while. But it's often guys with like, oh, they have two PhDs, one in economics and one in business, and they went to Harvard and they run a multinational corporation with thousands of employees, and the most overqualified, ridiculous people you'll ever meet in your life are sitting in those deputy minister positions. And they're supposed to be like not only like industry and bureaucratic juggernauts who can just pump out one good idea after another and are just like constantly innovating and constantly driving the organization forward. But what they aren't good at doing is the people aspect of their job and like rallying the nation together and pitching ideas to the public and seeing how the public reacts. And so politicians in a lot of ways are just the social media branch of the bureaucracy, because in Canada the bureaucracy drives almost all the decisions making forward. And so even when like politicians are considering new ideas, the federal government will send basically ideas off to the parliamentary budget office, and they'll cost it out to see how much it'll cost, what the likely repercussions will be from an economic perspective, and put together a report for everyone to see. And then that becomes the authoritative report on Canada's best guess on how this will be played out forward, and that's like the official guess that they have to use. But really, when we talk about authority and who actually drives things in general, it's the cabinets, whether it's in Ontario, like the provincial level, or in the federal level. Cabinet is driving all those decisions. And when we get to my Canada legal textbook, we can dive into that a bit more and how certain positions have even distinct duties within that, like specifically the Minister of Justice and who's the other one? The Minister of Justice, and the Minister of Finance. They both have like specific, I think, constitutional roles within that as well. Like Minister of Justice has to hold up the rule of law, and can't allow things to go forward unless it is consistent with the law. There's a real debate about whether or not that actually happens, because we're now dealing with party politics and basically letting the prime minister do whatever they want. We're often referred to as the friendly democracy, or sorry, the friendly dictatorship, because even though we're a democracy, I mean, our prime minister is usually elected with like between 30 and 40% of the popular vote, and often, so like only a minority of people actually vote for them, and they get 100% of the power. And when they are prime minister, they can employ a lot of tricks in order to ensure that they stay in power. So it's oftentimes, you can see throughout, like say like the 20th century, where it's often just like one liberal leader handing it off to the next liberal leader, and then whoever their minister of justice or finance was then often moves up and to become prime minister at a later time. Like how I think John Chrétien was finance minister for Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the minister of justice for, what was it, Louis Saint Laurent or Pearson, and it's just like one continual cycle of them just rotating their senior leadership into prime minister and carrying on that trend. But suffice to say, like going back to Carney, and I mean, it'll be interesting to see how he reacts once he has that formal bureaucracy underneath him and he starts to get used to and like being driven by a lot of these reports, because it seems like he's kind of approaching the economy from this like post-Obama era, where like Obama kind of laid the framework for not just like the carbon tax, but also environmental pricing in general. And he's really taken that idea and is bringing it forward again now, which it just doesn't make sense. And he's kind of misaligned on that issue, it seems like he wants to reform it, and that sounds great. Getting other countries to buy into it and getting actual dollars spent in this way, it seems like a long shot and doesn't actually seem effective. So it'll be interesting to see how he rolls that out and tries to gain cooperation when we have a figure like Trump in the States. So that's going to be interesting to watch for, to say the least. I don't think it'll. I think it'll get dropped from this platform, to be honest, as soon as he begins talking with foreign affairs. Um, but on the other side, it's undeniable that he knows how to, that he has relations with, like, perhaps with some large corporations that can drive some private investment into Canada to help us navigate these times. Because it seems like once AGI, artificial general intelligence, which I just watched a podcast from Ezra. Sorry, I'm jumping around so much, but from Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist. He's been putting out bangers lately, just describing what's been going on. His critiques of the Democratic Party in the States is largely a critique of the liberal movement in general, whereby you see these places where liberal politics are at play the most, say like in New York or in California, specifically the populous areas of California, and you see not only extreme unaffordability, but also high homeless rates and drug use, and like just like the social fabric just clearly breaking down. But also, like, they can't, they've lost all effectiveness in getting things done, and like this real critique of you've bureau like in the hopes of trying to do things properly, you've completely missed the point of getting things done pragmatically, and keeping society running is now less important than doing things properly. And clearly it's at odds with reality, and it's breaking down so much so people's idealistic nature, like, and this is why, like, perhaps the Democratic Party is losing so many people, is because it's not working in reality. Although we would like to live in cities that are well thought through and well designed, like Vancouver as a classic example. There's like, I have a whole book called Vancouverism about proper urban design, but it's like as soon as you build a nice city, everyone wants to live there. And so unless every city is going through this at the same time, there's no longer an incentive to stay where you are, but to go where the opportunities are, and to go to these mega city centers. And so like there's a lot of uh, um, urban people, urban planners, or urban thinkers, like Enid Slack from the University of Toronto. She was even, in one of her papers, she was advocating for uh, small communities need to accept urban decline and to plan for it accordingly, something along those lines. And well, so like as in like you need to accept the fact that urban city centers are going to be the way forward, and you just kind of need to accept this graceful decline as best you can because people aren't coming back to your small towns. But we've seen that trend really reverse as of like 2018 onwards, where a lot of people from city centers are moving out to the small towns because it's completely unaffordable, completely unlivable in these major city centers. And so, yeah, we have this real inversion taking place, not only culturally, or like, but politically as well. And so, like, people aren't just moving with their feet; they're starting to vote that way as well. And so, unless the Liberal Party can solve these long-term issues, it looks like Mark Carney may only be in, what do we say, the dynasties and interludes. Trudeau is clearly the dynasty. Will Carney be an interlude? Um, Much like how Paul Martin was an extension of the Chrétien era? Or will he be able to carve out his own niche and actually be able to provide something tangible to Canadian society, much like how, say, like the Pearson to Louis Saint Laurent handoff, where they both had substantial accomplishments in their own time of being prime minister. Uh, and so, like, yeah, you see like a real, ooh, is this is if Carney takes over, like, I mean, he'll become prime minister, but if he actually wins the general election, what kind of prime minister will he be? Will he be able to break through and actually become a dynasty or an interlude? And so right now it's like, number one, he's testing out the waters with all these speeches, but also he's trying to convince himself that he's Captain Canada and can actually lead us. Like, it's kind of like this weird dual process of him trying to convince himself and to actually step into the role of becoming prime minister after having not ever been elected before. But he's also trying to convince us as well that he has the plan and can make it happen. So it's kind of weird watching these introductory speeches, especially without actually seeing a plan or seeing how he's worked in the past, other than through other roles, right? So interesting times ahead for the Canadian political sphere. But alas, we can. This is not too long. I think we're only going from 422 to 436. Yeah, I've just been kind of eager to get into more of the modern topics. So just trying to brush through. I do really enjoy this book immensely. I don't think it's great podcast material. So we're just going to read these 14 or so pages and finish off the book, and then we'll move on to, I think next week was Aristotle, or not next week, but next books were Aristotle. What was he? Nicomachean Ethics, and he had another book, Politics. No, that wasn't the one I was going to read. But anyways, we'll do a deeper dive into Aristotle next time, and then move on from there. Okay, book 9. At last Socrates came to his description of the tyrant. He is the public fulfillment of the private desires which first quietly entered the city, hidden in the soul of the timocratic man. Once the pleasure of philosophy had disappeared, man is split between duty and desire with no adequate motive for the choice of duty over desire. Socrates indicates that the tyrant's life would be the appropriate choice of the way of life if philosophy did not exist, if the bodily pleasures were the only pleasures and the mind had no pleasures of its own. The self-control demanded by morality has no cosmic support if it is not in the service of a higher pleasure. The timocratic man's devotion to duty is groundless, and the oligarchic and democratic man represent unsteady compromises between duty and desire. Socrates can only prove the inferiority of the tyrannic life to Glaucon by way of the superiority of the philosophic life, of which Glaucon has only a glimmering. To be sure, he has prepared for the choice of the beautiful images of the philosophical life in Book 7, and by the moral indignation invoked by the decay of the political life depicted in Book 8. But although all men readily admit that to live under a tyranny is the worst of political fates, they are not so ready to admit that the tyrant is the unhappiest of men, precisely because he has succeeded in winning the struggle for those scarce goods which reputedly make a man happy. It is to this problem that Socrates addresses himself in Book 9. Socrates characterizes the tyrant as an erotic man, and eros, and as Cephalus said in the very beginning of the dialogue, is a mad master. Socrates now makes a further distinction among the unnecessary desires. Some of them are law-abiding, and others are law-breaking. The erotic desires led to breaking of the law, to daring everything, to the omnivorous taste for all good things, which make a man the enemy of law and other men. The democratic man was unerotic, and this gave him an easygoing, harmless quality and rendered him innocuous. His lack of erotic passion prevented him from taking anything very seriously. This is not the case with a man whose sexual passion is very intense. Glaucon is such a man, and it is the wish to satisfy this part of his nature that attracts him to tyranny. For tyranny is the only regime in which no satisfaction can be denied him. It provides the freedom, power, and money a lover needs. Eros is the most dangerous and powerful of the desires, an infinite longing which consumes all other attachments in its heat. It too, however, is ambiguous. Up to this point, the Republic has continuously attacked Eros when it has not overlooked it. It is hard to imagine that its author is also the author of the Symposium or the Phaedrus, But it must be observed that the Eros attacked is the lust for the other bodies, and that it is done in the name of both politics and philosophy. Politics seems to be hostile to any form of extreme eroticism, but what about philosophy? It is clear in Book 6 and 7 that love of wisdom is a form of Eros, and that the hostility to Eros is limited to the kind which precludes the development of the philosophical Eros. The political and philosophical critiques of Eros are therefore not in total harmony. If the radical incomplete discussion of the soul in the Republic were to be made comprehensive, it would have to be enlarged to provide an adequate account of Eros. The present interpretation of Eros does serve the purpose of moderating Glaucon's passion, which is both anti-political and anti-philosophic, but the obvious incompleteness of this understanding of Eros leads to an awareness of a hidden kinship between the tyrant and the philosopher. There are certain kinds of things which a gentleman is not willing to think about, let alone do. Sometimes against his will such things find expression in his dreams. The tyrant is willing both to think about them and to do them when wide awake. The philosopher, as we've seen in the Republic, is at least willing to think about them, and they hold none of the peculiar horror for him that they do for the gentleman. This is because both tyrant and philosopher deprecate law or convention in their quest for nature. Eros is nature's demonic voice. The tyrant and philosopher are united in their sense of their radical incompleteness and their longing for wholeness, in their passion and in their single-mindedness. They are the truly dedicated men. The potential tyrant, if saved from corruption, may also very well be the potential philosopher. The young man drawn to tyranny, like the philosopher, is allowed to flourish only in the democracy. Socrates, by curing Glaucon of his lust for tyrannic pleasures, can indulge his own lust for beautiful souls, while at the same time acting the part of the good citizen who defends the city's regime. The democracy satisfies everything. It lets Socrates be a philosopher, at least until he is 70, and provides him with students by allowing the emergence of unnecessary and unlawful desires, and by permitting him to convert those possessed by the desires of philosophy. It gives him the opportunity to show that he loves his country. Socrates attempts to prove to Glaucon that the tyrant is the unhappiest of men. His argument consists of two parts. In the first place, the tyrant cannot fulfill his desires. He must always continue in his longing, becoming hated and do every terrible deed. In sum, he is the least self-sufficient of men, utterly dependent on external things and thus full of anxiety. Second, the tyrannic life is not the pleasantest life. The latter argument is again divided into two parts. According to the first, each of the three parts of the soul has its own specific pleasure. The man who knows all three pleasures would be the best judge of which is the greatest pleasure. Only the philosopher knows all three. However, he chooses the pleasures of philosophy. According to the second part of the argument, the tyrant's pleasures are all mixed and allied to pain, while the philosophic pleasures are pure. The tyrant's pleasures are unreal because they are linked to becoming, which is itself somehow unreal. The philosopher is attached to being, and hence his pleasures are real. It will be noted that Socrates makes the choice between tyranny and philosophy dependent on pleasure. This aspect of teaching of the Republic is powerfully presented by Aristotle in Politics, in criticizing an economic solution to the political problem advanced by Philus and Chalcedon. Aristotle asserts that there are three causes of men's doing injustice. Want of necessities, desire for more than what is necessary, and desire to enjoy independent pleasures which are pure and unmixed with pain. In Socrates' presentation, the oligarch is preoccupied with the necessary, the democrat with the unnecessary, and the tyrant with the unlawful pleasures. Aristotle explicitly identifies the man who wishes the pleasures which have no admixture of pain with the one who commits the greatest crimes and longs for tyranny. He also indicates that this is the most interesting kind of man. He suggests three cures for the three causes of injustice: a small amount of property and work, moderation, and philosophy. The quest for the pure pleasures is the motivation for the higher kind of free man who no longer has to worry about the necessary. But this quest can only be fulfilled through philosophy because, quote, the other pleasures require human beings, end quote. Only philosophy is pure pleasure and is self-sufficient, not entailing the use of other men. Most radically posed, the moral problem consists in a simple alternative. Either philosophy or tyranny is the best way of life. Other solutions are only halfway measures. If philosophy did not exist, tyranny would be the destridatum which only a lack of vigor would cause one to reject. I think it's interesting. Want of necessities, desire for more than what is necessary, and a desire to enjoy independent pleasures. I mean, there's, other than him just declaring it, there's nothing really to back that up. Like, there's no. It's very different to modern philosophy and modern academic writing in general. It's, as long as it fits within his holistic worldview, it's just kind of taken as fact, which is interesting. Okay. This choice between the philosophic and tyrannic lives explain the plot of the Republic. Socrates takes a young man tempted by the tyrannic life and attempts to give him at least that modicum of awareness of philosophy which will cure him of the lust for tyranny. Any other exhortation would amount to empty moralism. The young man drawn to tyranny is the illustration of Aristotle's maxims that man is both the best and the worst of animals, and that the man living outside the city must be either a god or a beast. In the Republic, Socrates has included both god and beast in the city, and this accounts for the difference between his political science and Aristotle's. Socrates, unlike Aristotle, makes eros a political principle. Although tyranny and the tyrannic man are in one way the furthest from philosophy, they are in another the nearest to it. This is why Socrates is attracted to those dangerous young men, the potential tyrants who are products of the democracy. With some of these young men, his training failed, and as a result he was condemned. But with others, he succeeded. And they have exculpated him. Since the time when Glaucon first asked for a comparison of the lives of the just and unjust men, the action of the Republic has steadily moved towards it. The question has changed en route, for the comparison is now between the philosopher and the tyrant. This would not have satisfied Glaucon at the beginning, nor does it prove the superiority of justice over injustice, unless justice is philosophy and injustice tyranny, but such a compromise does cast light on the original problem. Although the just man on the rack is not proved to be happy, it is clear that happiness does not depend on anything tyranny can acquire. Glaucon's notion of the good things has been altered by the marvelous things he has experienced in the conversation. Previously, he thought that both just and unjust man desired the same things. Now he sees the possibility of a life, the life of Socrates, which is self-sufficient and happy. The needfulness of tyranny has become questionable, and Glaucon will never again be able to possess the problem as he once did. Happiness is not connected with the exploitation of other human beings. Socrates makes an image of the soul for Glaucon's benefit. The desiring part is compared to the many-headed beast, the spirited part to a lion, and the rational part to a man. Socrates thus explains that the laws which impose moderation are not made in the interest of the exploiter, but in the interest of the soul as opposed to the body, of reason as opposed to desire. This would, of course, hold true only in the best regime, but Glaucon himself is now able to say that makes no difference. Previously it had appeared that one must found a city and live within it to be a complete man, but now it appears that a man can be happy on his own. The good city exists only in speech, and is a pattern in the sky for those who want to live well. Justice is obedience to the laws of the regime. At last, man can break from the earthly city, and Glaucon has gained his inner freedom and its claims and its charms. With the confrontation of the philosopher and the tyrant, the discussion appears to have reached its end. But Socrates once more raises the subject of poetry. This is surprising, and it is difficult to see why we should return to this topic after a lengthy discussion in Book 3. That treatment, however, dealt only with the uses and disadvantages of poetry in the education of the warriors, who needed courage and sultry tales which would encourage it. Homer is the teacher of Greeks, and his title to that role must be examined. In the earlier discussion, Homer's hero, Achilles, was the theme. In this discussion, Homer himself is the theme. The light tone adopted by Socrates here, the ease with which he apparently dismisses poetry, must not cause one to forget that he is taking it very seriously indeed. Poetry is the opponent, and there is an ancient quarrel between it and philosophy. Homer is read or listened to by all the Greeks. He speaks of all things in their interrelations, and he tells of the gods. Homer and the other great poets constitute the respectable tribunal before which philosophy is tried. Socrates is afraid of being denounced by them Socrates is afraid of being denounced to them as though they were the law, and in a sense they do reflect that law and determine the opinions that make it. However, Book 10 attempts to reverse this situation. Socrates begins by making an apology to the poets, and ends by opening the way for them to make an apology to him. Socrates does not wish to destroy poetry, he only wishes to judge it, rather than be judged by it. The other themes of Book 10 help to clarify the grounds for this final consideration of poetry. The immortality of the soul and the rewards of justice are also discussed, particularly the rewards after death. Moreover, Book 10 culminates in the poetic myth. After appearing to reject poetry, Socrates uses it to describe the cosmos and the fate of man, the broadest possible objects of human discourse. Poetry is necessary to Socrates' project of reforming Glaucon, but it must be a new kind of poetry, one which can sustain Glaucon in a life of moral virtue and respect for philosophy. It is not, then, that poetry must be entirely banished, but that it must be reformed. Book 10 begins with a criticism of Homeric poetry and ends with an example of Socratic poetry. Separating the two is a discussion of the immorality of the soul. The difference between the old poetry and the new lies in their understanding of the soul. The old poetry seems to lead necessarily to a view of the soul which is inimical to philosophy. The cosmos or chaos of pre-Socratic poetry contained no support of either the moral or theoretical life. The ocean river which surrounds Homer's world is a thing of constant, meaningless change. Poetry, taken on its own ground, portraying those subjects on which it can best reveal its powers, culminates in the hero Achilles. And it is Achilles who bemoans his fate and asserts his preference for serfdom on earth to the kingdom over the dead. Life, mere life, is all that counts, for what is beyond it is a void, justifying neither a life of nobility nor one of learning. The text for the Republic, Book 10, is Odyssey. Book 9, the account of Odysseus' visit to the dead. The difference between Odysseus' experiences among the dead and those of is an indication of what Socrates is trying to teach. Found rewards and punishments for just and unjust souls, but, more important, he also found an order of the universe which makes this world intelligible and provides a ground for the contemplative life. At the source of all things, saw that a soul, the first principle of the cosmic order, hence the proper study of the universe is the study of the soul. What is best in man is not in conflict but in harmony with the nature of things. The myth of is only a tale, just as Odysseus' descent to Hades. There is small likelihood that Socrates believed in the survival of the individual soul, but this tale is a poetic reflection of the view which makes philosophy possible, just as it is indicated that Homer's tale reflects the view connected with autonomous poetry. Men need poetry, but the kind of poetry which nourishes their soul makes all the difference in their understanding of their non-poetic lives. Socrates outlines a new kind of poetry which leads beyond itself, which does not present man's only alternatives as tragic or comic, which supports the philosophic life. He gives the principle which Aristotle developed in the Poetics, and which is embodied in the works of men such as Dante and Shakespeare. It is still poetry, but poetry which points beyond itself. Socrates begins with his quarrel with Homer by asking Glaucon what he would think of a craftsman who is not only able to make all implements, but also makes everything that grows naturally from the earth and produces all animals, all the others and himself too, and in addition produces earth and heaven and God and everything in heaven and everything in Hades and under the earth. Glaucon responds that such a man must be a most amazing sophist, but Socrates hastens to assure him that this maker's power is nothing surprising and is within everyone's reach. Socrates tells Glaucon, "If you are willing to take a mirror and carry it around everywhere, quickly you will make the sun and the things in the heaven, quickly the earth, and quickly yourself, and the other implements and plants and everything else that was just now mentioned." This seems an almost unbelievably crude and insensitive way to deprecate the value of poetry's representations. Socrates accuses the poet of being a charlatan, who deceives men and who has no claim to wisdom whatsoever. However, a closer examination of the passage cited will show that Socrates' point here is subtler than immediately appears. The man who carries a mirror round will not catch the reflections of some of the things which appeared in the sophist's mirror. No ordinary mirror can reflect the gods and the things in Hades. The sun would have to take their place. Only the poets and the painters can reproduce the gods and the life after death, and they have no models for their imitation of them in the works of the other craftsmen or in the visible universe. The poets are the authentic, the only teachers about the gods. The great mystery is how they find out about them, how they are able to present them to men. Socratic poetry must tell about the god and the afterlife. This does not constitute the difference between the old poetry and the new. The gods are the center, not to say the essence of both. The real quarrel between Socrates and Homer concerns the way in which one finds out about the gods, or the view of the whole which causes a poet to present the gods in one way rather than another. Socrates' criticism of Homeric poetry is really a study of the principles of his theogony or theology, a study of the nature of the Homeric gods. Socrates' first step in his analysis of Homeric wisdom is to attempt to establish the nature of a poem. A poem, he asserts, like a painting, is a particular being which has a curious sort of essence. It represents other particular beings, which are beings because they, in turn, partake of a single, self-subsistent being. Poetry is dependent on the world around us. It does not make its objects, and its strength comes from the depth of its grasp of those objects. Socrates makes the point that Homer's book presupposes knowledge of the book of the world, which Homer does not make, but he is not creative and must not be judged by that external standard. Poetry is imitation. Now Socrates takes that strange step of testing the poet's knowledge by comparing it to the knowledge of the artisan who makes the thing imitated. This procedure has a kind of surface plausibility, in that the poem does indeed imitate the objects of the various arts, and that the knowledge of the latter belongs to the practitioners of those arts. In this way, the poet comes off very badly indeed, because he is surely not a knower of all the diverse arts. His representations is only a shadow of the competent opinions of the artisans. But all of this is somehow very wrong. In the first place, not everything represented in poetry is an artifact. Indeed, its most interesting objects are not products of art. Second, Poetry presents its objects in their intolerations, as no particular art can do. This specialist in health does not, as such, know the proper uses of a healthy body. Poetry is essentially comprehensive or synoptic. Synoptic. Okay. And this distinguishes it from the special arts. The poem is a collection of imitations, but is informed by the vision of the poet, a vision that transcends the level of the special arts. The further development of the argument gradually reveals the reasons for this unusual presentation, since it has been determined that the artisans are the standard of knowledge. It follows that if Homer is to be authoritative, he must have exercised all of the arts, or at least the important ones. Homer, if he was so skilled and is an appropriate teacher of the Greeks, should be famous for his deeds as well as his speeches. His favorite themes are human virtues and vices. So it is proper to see what he did as a legislator, general, educator, etc. If it is evident that he had a reputation in none of these fields, and it is even said that he was neglected and abandoned in his own lifetime. It therefore follows that Homer is not a reliable teacher of the most important human things. The tacit assumption of the argument is that it is better to be a doer than a knower, or that knowledge is only tested in action, in benefits to other men. But a moment's reflection makes one aware that these charges against Homer apply at least as well to Socrates. He was not a lawgiver, a leader in war, an inventor, or a professor in the manner of Protagoras. There was also no way of life named after Socrates, as there was a Pythagorean way of life. He was worse than neglected by his contemporaries. Yet he, too, understood himself to be wise in human things. The authority to talk about human things does not come from the study of any of the arts, and Homer and Socrates are one in their neglect of the arts and their divorce from the practical life. What Socrates shows in this presentation is that the ordinary standards for judgment of the worthy of an activity or depth of knowledge are not applicable to Homer or himself. Wisdom has another source than art, and there is another kind of relation to the ideas than that of the artisan. A wise man is judged, not by any deed that he performs, but by the quality of his knowledge. And that knowledge is not like that of the artisan who produces something, which can be used and who deals with a special subject matter. Wisdom is sought for its own sake, and it is comprehensive, interrelating the various arts and their products. Both Homer and Socrates in some way possess this kind of knowledge. They both have a view of the whole. Homer produces a product, as the artisans do, but that product is distinguished from the artisan's product in that it reflects a view of the whole, and its maker is by its very nature a man who must reflect on the whole. What Socrates implicitly criticizes Homer for is that he cannot explain the grounds for that view of the whole, or for the way of life devoted to knowing it. Homer appears as a celebrator of heroes, of men of action, and hence as their inferior. Speech seems to be subordinate to deed. Nothing in the Homeric poems indicates the dignity of the poet. There are no heroes who give an account of the poet's own doings. Nor is there a picture of the universe which makes it possible to comprehend the possibility of wisdom. Socrates accuses Homer of not reflecting on himself, and hence making a world in which there is no place for himself. His poem is not a compendium of imitations of the various arts, because it is animated by a view of the whole, but because he does not provide a basis for that view, because the truth of that view is not the center of the poet's concern. Socrates is legitimated in treating him as though he were merely a universal imitator of the arts to be judged by every artisan, or an incomplete statesman. This line of reasoning serves to point up the way in which Homer differs from the artisans and the men of action and is like Socrates. They are both devoted to the most comprehensive understanding of things. The real question, then, is what is the source of status of the view of the whole which informs Homer's work? In the next part of the discussion, Socrates explores this question. He had early asserted that the painter, or implicitly the poet, is the one of the three craftsmen who in who in a way make the same product, and that he stands furthest of the three from what is. A divine craftsman makes the idea, for example, of the bed. A human craftsman looks to the idea of a bed and makes a bed, and the painter or poet looks to the bed made by the human craftsman and makes an image of the bed. He is thus an imitator of the imitator, and his products have very little in reality. Now, however, Socrates abandons this reference to the ideas and their maker, and no longer asserts that the craftsmen look to ideas in their making. He substitutes a common sense notion for all of this. The craftsman is indeed dependent, however, not on an idea, but on the command of the man who uses his products. The poet is still at the bottom, but now there is a human being at the top who practices what Socrates calls the user's art. The horseman, who knows the equipment necessary to using a horse well, can tell the artisans what he needs and give them their impulse without knowing their arts. He is more important than they are, and the end of their activity is his activity. The user's art comes closer to poetry and philosophy in that it, too, deals with the relations of things and is not restricted to any single art. The broadest such art would be the one that treats of happiness, the legislator's art. The legislator organizes the whole city with a view to the good life, the end of all action, and the various arts ultimately are guided by the role their products play in that life. The horseman who told the saddle maker and the blacksmith what he needed is in turn told by the general what is needed from the cavalry, and the general, finally, is told by the statesman or the legislator what the army must do. Only the legislator oversees the whole, and by looking to the legislator, the artisans know what the purpose or end of their products is. There is no idea which the legislator can look to and imitate mechanically. His art comprises wisdom entire. The user's art is political science, of which Socrates is a founder. To follow out the image of the republic, the sheep are guarded by the dogs, who are obedient to the shepherds, who are in the service of owners. The people are guarded by warriors, who are obedient to guardians, who are ultimately obedient to philosophers, or who are philosophers themselves. In the best case, the legislators are philosophers, but in any case, the legislator is the master of the city. Yeah, I mean, this is fundamentally the breakdown in modern times seems to be the idea that we are no longer striving to create cities for the sake of happiness, but for the sake of power and security, I guess would be the best underlying motivations. When we talk about position versus interest, we have our stated positions of what we are trying to accomplish, say whatever deals that are currently underway, but our underlying positions is our internal motivation for what we're actually looking for, and that could be security, prosperity, but it doesn't seem like modern day we're trying to maximize happiness. We're trying to maximize productivity and security, because if we have a large economy, then we have more status and security and economic advantage in the world. And so human happiness is not really in human happiness is only useful insofar as it helps sustain the people to keep the economy running. That seems to be it's a secondary motivation at best in modern times, and so that's why we have such bizarre systems in general. And that's why I guess I think I lean so heavily towards, because there's a pragmatic reality that we need a strong economy, we need strong security, and a lot of those things that the conservative parties often hammer on about. But also, the underlying point of a city is for it to be useful and good for its citizens. And so, which is why I lean a bit further to the left, because without those things that make a city worthwhile for people to live in, people won't want to live in it. And so if we continually allow our cities to turn into slums because we need to continually sharpen our pencils to make more money and profits, to increase our security, then we're going to be in a city that's uninspired and not actually it won't actually accomplish its primary objective, because it'll fail on the second ground of not actually being a city that anyone wants to actually live in. So it's interesting, like these leftist cities have become so nice of a place and like this idealistic notion that it's crumbled in on itself by attracting too many people to it. Where if all these people just stayed where they were and adopted those policies, say like these liberal policies that are making a city enticing, like say like transportation networks and walkable cities and or active transportation plans, then perhaps people might have stayed where they were, and instead of all congregating in mega city centers. But I mean that's not a reality either. Like ultimately both approaches fail, but just on different grounds. So I that's seems to be where the Liberal Party can really step in and serve that Canadian role, which they have done for basically our whole history. But okay. Mhm. I'll just read the last line again. In the best case, the legislators are philosophers, but in any case, the legislator is the master of the city. In this perspective, it becomes clear what Socrates means when he says that the poet is an imitator of an imitator. The poet imitates the legislator. He must appeal to his audience. But in that sense, he imitates the tastes and passions of that audience. But the tastes and passions of the audience who are performed by the legislator, who is understood to the craftsman who builds the city according to the patterns provided by his view of nature. Thus, the poet who looks to the audience, which looks to the legislator, is at the third remove from nature. The poet's function leads him to be a servant of convention. His works give the illusion of nature, but are fundamentally affected by convention, and thus they deceive man in his quest for nature. To put the same thing in a different way, the poet must imitate heroes in his poems, but those heroes are the heroes of his nation, who are also children of the legislator or the founder of the Greek way of life, because the poet looks to what is around him or is conveyed by the tradition, and because he must appeal to an audience, he is particularly prone to become involved in the populist prejudices. Rousseau, in his letter to Delabert, D apostrophe Alembert. Rousseau is French, so has accurately reproduced this aspect of Socrates' critique of poetry and given it a modern force. What Socrates stresses is that there is nothing on the poet's art which impels him to the discovery of what is truly natural, and much that inclines him to serve convention. If a poet shares the perspective of the philosophic legislator, if he is capable of moral and intellectual virtue required for such a liberation, and if that perspective can inform his poetry, Socrates has no quarrel with him. From this viewpoint, one can also understand what Socrates meant by treating the poet as an imitator of artifacts. In one sense, man is a natural being, but in another he is a product of nomos, convention. Men and men's ways differ from place to place as trees as their ways do not. The law transforms men to such an extent that many can doubt whether there is such a thing as human nature at all. Even if there is a natural man, or, more classically expressed, a man who lives according to nature, civil society and its laws must aid in his coming to be. Civil men, the dweller in the cave, are in the decisive sense the artifacts of the legislator. Their opinions are made by him. Human making has a great deal to do with our perception of even the things which seem most unambiguously natural. Men see the beautiful sunset, the noble river, the terrifying storm, or the sacred cow. To know these things, we must separate what belongs to them naturally from what opinion adds to them. Poetry tends to blend the natural and conventional elements in things, and it charms men in such a way that they no longer see the seams of the union of these two elements. It is not sufficient, however, to say that the poet is an imitator of an imitator, For Socrates knows that the poet is not simply slavishly subservient to the law and the legislator, but the tragic poet depicts men's misfortunes and their lamentations. In Book 3, it was stated that good men do not suffer at the loss of those dear to them, and the poets had been commanded to so depict them. Now Socrates admits that they do indeed lament, but they do so in private. The poet's faults lies in publicizing what is properly private. His crime consists of breaking the legislator's command that moral virtue must always be represented as leading to happiness. In other words, the poet tells the truth about the passions, a truth suppressed by law. Men are attached to their own things, and much of the significance of life comes from those things, which are not necessarily acquired or kept by the exercise of the moral virtues. The legislator taught that nobility and happiness are one. The poets separate the two and reveal the truth. As a matter of fact, the legislator, as we saw in Book 3, turns to the poet when he wishes to learn the nature of the human passions, in order to know what in man in order to know what in man has to be overcome in order to establish a good regime. Socrates studies Homer. Homer, then, is not Socrates' opponent because he knows nothing of nature. It is rather because he knows only that part of nature which causes men to laugh or cry, the part that makes human life appear either ridiculous or miserable. The poet deals with the failures of acting men and show what the Republic has also shown, that the practical or moral life is essentially self-contradictory, and is hence either comic or tragic. But the poets do not show, and perhaps do not believe in, the possibility of a non-contradictory life, lived by a man who is neither comic nor tragic. They water men's laughters and his pity without giving him a counterpose. Hence they justify laughter and pity as an ultimate response to the human situation. Pity in particular is a passion connected with one's own possible sufferings. It sees the losses suffered by even the noblest of men and recognizes how threatened are the things for which a man lives. Pity, growing great, ends in terror caused by the misery of men's existence. The man overwhelmed by pity and fear is the man least of all able to forget himself and his own, and hence the things that will protect him and give his life meaning. Most of all, he looks to the laws and the gods, and his pity can well make him a fanatic. His pity can well make him a fanatic. The natural possessions of men, which Homer knows and appeals to, are those that most attach a man to convention and hence to bondage in the cave. And the Homeric gods are such as to encourage and satisfy the pitying part of a man's soul. Socrates admits the overwhelming charm of poetry, a charm composed of elements drawn on the one hand from the attachment to one's particular existence and what is connected with it, and on the other hand from the pleasure which accompanies the contemplation of the truth. But the truth which poetry reveals is only a partial truth, and in liberating from the conventions or laws of a city, it can contribute to an enslavement to the source of convention, the love of one's own. Reason is the only instrument with which to fight laughter and pity, but poetry belongs essentially to the facility of imagination, a facility necessary to reasoning, one, however, which can also be at war with it. The overcoming of the attachment to one's own is a monstrous endeavor, and the passions served by poetry rebel against it. But the endeavor is necessary to philosophy. This, then, is the essence of the quarrel between philosophy and poetry. Socrates banishes poetry once more, but this time it offers it a return if it can learn to argue, to justify itself before the bar of philosophy. He points the way to Aristotle's understanding of tragedy as a purgation of the passions of pity and fear rather than their satisfaction. Such tragedy would prepare a man to be reasonable and moderate after having purged those terrible passions. It would pay attention to man's necessary love of his own, but would temper in such a way as to allow him some freedom from it. Thus tragedy would neither give way to these passions nor to deny their existence. It would then be an important part of the education of decent, unfanatic men. Poetry will return, but only after having learned to subordinate itself, to mitigate its unguided tendencies towards indulgence and fanaticism. When the poets depict the gods, they must no longer look to laughter and pity, but to the ideas. The discussion of poetry is a preparation for a discussion of the rewards and punishments of justice and injustice. We are on the third last page. 1, 2.5. Poetry will tell, as it always has, the tales of the wages of virtue in this life and the next. The theme appears to be more appropriate to the poetic than philosophic treatment, both in terms of the things discussed and the audience to which it is relevant. Socrates, in undertaking this discussion, disobeys Glaucon's explicit command, for the latter had insisted that a true praise of justice in itself would have to abstract from any rewards extrinsic to justice which might accrue to it. Socrates thus returns to the conventional way of praising justice which Adeimantus has criticized. Glaucon and Adeimantus permit Socrates to do so because they now are more favorably disposed to justice. Socrates must do so because the dialogue has not sufficiently demonstrated that citizen virtue is choice-worthy for itself, and Glaucon and Adeimantus are not capable of philosophic virtue. The first step of the praise is to extend the range of consideration beyond this life to eternity, because eternity is the proper study of man, and because the promiscuity of fortune in this life would tend to make man believe that justice goes unrewarded and injustice unpunished. So Socrates undertakes to convince Glaucon that the soul is immortal. This discussion can hardly rank as proof, and there is no attempt at all to show that the individual soul is immortal, which is the only thing a man anxious about his faith and afterlife would care about. Moreover, Socrates admits that we know nothing about the soul, which denies the value of argument, calling into question the teaching of the whole dialogue, which was based on an undertaking of the soul. This discussion serves two purposes: to cause the unphilosophic man to be concerned about justice for fear of what will happen to him in another world, and to turn philosophic men to the study of the soul. The soul is the philosophic question, and it is his concern for this question that distinguishes Socrates from his predecessors. The most characteristic part of his teaching is that the soul is irreducible, and that it is somehow the principle of the cosmos. The shade of Achilles in Hades is offensive not only to good morals, but to the possibility of philosophy. For Achilles seems to show that the human soul has no support in the cosmos. Socratic thought combines the apparently contradictory concerns of earlier poetry and earlier philosophy. He can understand men and understand nature, for the two are informed by the same principle, soul. The Republic, which seems to give a completed teaching about politics and the soul, ends with a return to the philosophical doubt, to the convention of one's opinions are open to unanswered, if not unanswerable, questions. In one sense, one can say that the book has taught us nothing other than the necessity of philosophy and its priority and superiority to the political life. The myth of merely reiterates this message. According to this myth, there is a rational cosmic order to which each individual's fate is attached. In the afterlife, happiness and misery are distributed according to virtues and vices practiced during life. This encourages decent men to persist in their efforts to be virtuous, for if they succeed, a wonderful 1,000-year voyage through the heavens awaits them. But the myth also makes clear that the civic virtues do not suffice for a man's salvation for all eternity, and that, unless he is philosophized on earth, this voyage will profit him nothing. For each man must choose a new life, and that new life will determine whether he will fare well or ill in his next 1,000-year sojourn among the dead. The correct choice of a life depends on knowledge of the soul, not on practice of moral virtue. Those who have been rewarded for moral virtue in the afterlife are less well prepared than are those who have been punished to make proper choice of life. We see a decent man, one like Cephalus, who has just come from his rewards, choose a tyrant life, for only law and convention has kept him in bounds of in his earlier life, and his real view of happiness led him to envy tyrants. He has learned nothing in the afterlife. There is apparently no philosophy in the afterlife for those who did not practice it on earth. The soul is not perfected by the separation from the body. For all men, other than the philosopher, there is a constant charge of fortune from happiness to misery and back. The myth attributes full responsibility to men for what happens to them, and thus teaches that there is no sin but ignorance. The key to Ur's account of his visit to the other world is the absence of Achilles. He says that Ajax was the 20th soul he saw. Ajax was the 20th shade seen by Odysseus on his voyage to Hades. One of the shades which accompanied Ajax, and the one on which Odysseus spoke just prior to speaking with Ajax, was that of Achilles, who at that point made his complaint about Hades quoted at the beginning of the book 3. Makes no mention of whom he saw with Ajax. Achilles would no longer exists, alive or dead, in the new poetry or the new Socratic world. Correspondingly, the wise voyager Odysseus gains higher status. All he needed was to be cured of love of honor, a form of spiritedness, and he could live the obscure but happy life of Socrates. In this, Socrates also gets his inspiration from Homer, and thus he lets us know that there may be another side to Homer's poetry than that which the tradition has popularized. At all events, the teaching of the myth is a strictly human one. Man in this life, without being otherworldly, can attain self-sufficient happiness in the exercise of his natural powers, and only in this way will he partake of eternity to the extent a human being can do so. Otherwise stated, only the philosopher has no need of the myth. On this note of the discussion ends, Glaucon having learned his lesson in moderation, and Socrates thereby having made his apology, the apology of a man who benefits others because he first of all knows how to benefit himself. I guess it's interesting on a number of different points. Number one, the introduction of sin in the afterlife, and how you conduct yourself in this current life will determine in Hades how your soul will be treated for the 1,000 years thereafter. That 1,000 years is also reflected in Christian mythology. We won't call that mythology, but Christian religion as the 1,000-year reign after the resurrection, and also how your sin in this world will also determine your outcome in the next world. Like we see again more parallels between this and that. There's also, interestingly, the idea of the noble lie and the creation of myths in order to subjugate the population, which could then be seen as Christianity being a move from the elites in order to, again, subjugate the masses. But again, there's limited proof for that. So, I mean, take it with a grain of salt for sure. But, like, there definitely begins to point cracks in the system. And Christianity just didn't come out of nowhere either. Like, it comes up in the idea after there's an idea that, oh, gods can exist, that there's an afterlife. Like, these core ideas already exist. But if we're looking for, like, say, like, an atheist perspective on why to be moral, that, like, you get into the philosophy of religion questions that just, like, spiral quickly. Climate change is particularly interesting because if you don't have children, say if you're a single person who is not married and does not have children, nor do you plan to partake in the future in that way, what motivation is there for you to be environmentally conscious? What motivation is there for you to vote for those things to keep the world going? other than some abstract notion that like you want humankind to flourish into the future and to speak of human deeds kindly in the future and about this time period kindly because you are sharing this identity of humanity and in this time period. But there's another really interesting book I have called Afterlife, which is like a modern philosopher's take on death and the afterlife, and that whole dealing with that question specifically, like why should we care about the future if we aren't going to be the ones to inherit it or to participate it indirectly through offspring. And yeah, there's some really I have to go back through that book again because it was if a lot of the arguments in that book flew over my head because it was just like it got so deep so quickly, and so I'll have to read it again probably a couple times in order to be able to piece together those arguments well. But yeah, I think that's really our treatment of Plato. I really think like book 7 is the high point for this book, where it's like talking about the cave and education and really that process of enlightenment coming out of the cave. But I also really like how like the philosopher is distinct in this society, whereby they're the ones who are realistically judging what is going on, taking the arguments about their facts, and even though he provides no real basis for it, it's kind of uh, biblical and poetic in a lot of ways, this book, because it's not based on anything other than an old man's understanding of the world. It's kind of like this he's the notions of the harmonies, like we of course want to live in a harmonious society where people get along and the the gears in the machine work together seamlessly. That's undeniable. Like we clearly strive for that as human beings. But his perception of the tripart soul is interesting. There's not really reason to believe him, but the idea that he creates, that Socrates and Plato are really the founders of political science and the philosophic way of life in treating philosophy as distinct and different from poetry and from the legislator's life, and how the philosopher should be informing the legislator and the legislator should be enacting the actions, who oversee the guardians, who protect the merchants and the other citizens of the community. We also can recognize that he also got some things wrong, like politics is essentially a negotiation between the rulers and those who are ruled, because we know rulers cannot unequivocally hold power over those who are unruled unless they use undemocratic means to do so. So we also know that like this goal of politics and really respectful politics, which incorporates human rights into it at a very baseline, must be a negotiation between those with and without power, and must ensure that there is a certain level of happiness to the city in order for the rulers to get what they want as well. So, in a lot of ways, I see the Liberal Party actually trying to navigate that sphere and trying to continue this negotiation between the haves and have-nots, where you go further in either direction on the political sphere, and it doesn't feel like they have those same kind of concerns for the other side of things. And I think that's why the liberals have been so pivotal and so good at being this moderator between capitalism and social justice and the happiness of the citizens of Canada versus the corporate interests of Canada, and trying to balance the two to ensure that we not only have security and economic prosperity, but also so that the citizens also have a certain quality of life that we have been notorious for in the past. That promise is certainly breaking down now and will continue to break down. There's likelihood that we if I was to, sometimes Danielle and I joke about having a wall of predictions, but it seems like we very much could head towards uh, people economists continue saying that we have a strong economy and there's not really a reason to go into a recession. at this point because the economic figures are still looking relatively strong. I mean, that's starting to erode more and more as people are spending less. But if consumer sentiment remained high, there wouldn't really be much reason for us to go into a recession. But it seems like it's inevitable with global uncertainties and with everything else like that. We'll begin heading into a recession. It feels like we're heading into the top of we're topping out from a market perspective and are starting to head lower now. But it seems like we're going to be heading into a recession by June for sure. But the other, I guess, headwind against the economy is artificial intelligence because, well, it seems like it's not overly effective and useful right now, like AI. It is currently writing what I think up to like 75% of code, computer code at this point, especially for these major corporations who can use AI more seamlessly. But also, it's also doing a lot of the writing for, I mean, especially for students who are utilizing now in university. It's just like university has become drastically different from when I was there. Like people are, just gotta let the dogs out. People are using AI to like just take pictures of math problems and having the computer solve it for them, and then just trying to understand it after the fact, if they even try to understand it at all. So like you're seeing this massive shift in, and like professors certainly don't know how to handle this, where like AI is just taking. Sorry, do you want to go ahead? AI is just taking over in the intellectual and information space, and so if we generally know that recessions take 12. Okay, go on out, girl. Come on. If we generally can presume that recessions take 12 to 18 months to happen, and we can say that, say, like a recession is starting now to June, so we'll say like 12 months from now, another full year, we're expecting AGI, artificial general intelligence, to come online in the next like 2 to 4 years. And it's happening a lot quicker than we initially anticipated because these just advancements and competition have just driven things so exponentially fast and much quicker than we ever anticipated. From anything from like the developments out of China to like massive billion-dollar pots of money being put aside to try to take advantage of AI. It's crazy. Ezra Klein just did an hour-long podcast on it that I listened to, and it's just like it's coming quick. It's going to be more powerful than we expect. And like while the use cases aren't great at this point, like if it's already writing 75% of code, then it's not going to be long before they're just doing all of it and can do everything that we would expect it to do, and even research projects for us. Like it's coming quick, and then it's going to devastate the job market. And then it's going to be, how do we continue to keep people employed while doing something productive for society or for the market in general, without needing AI to, because only a few people will need to oversee the AI functions to ensure that it's actually hitting its marks. And then only for how long will we actually need that before it becomes 100% proficient? Excellent questions that'll come into play over the next few years. So it very well could end up that we end up in a depression without a clear path forward on how do we A, keep people meaningfully employed, B, how do we keep people from ending in starvation if we don't have enough jobs for everybody, and who is going to pay for UBI if we then have to implement that? Will these businesses stay in Canada if they don't have to be? I guess we then have to, anything that can't be done by a computer will then have to be done by human, right? And the only jobs left will be teaching, doing the actual physical manual labor jobs, and then we'll be shrinking these administrative workforces. So should be interesting times ahead, for sure. But AI is definitely coming, and likely before 2030. So we'll see what happens. And yay for economic downturns, I guess. Anyways, that's all for me for today. And hopefully tomorrow or whenever we can get into Aristotle